Morning. Good morning, you good people. Good afternoon, wherever in the world you are, because the Ayn Rand Center UK knows no borders. We are around the world broadcasting live to you and talking about, well, it's Peikoff Wednesday. We are talking about the ideas of Leonard Peikoff, and specifically today, the answers of Leonard Peikoff. As you know, we've been working from the book, Keeping It Real, bringing ideas down to earth. James Valliant, is this a magnificent collection or what? I don't know that we're ever going to run out of fresh and important ideas to talk about from this book.
You know, this book was culled from thousands of answers that Dr. Peikoff gave on his podcasts and radio shows over the years. And this is really just a selection. And you're absolutely right. Just this selection provides infinite material. We could go back over some of these questions in different contexts and with the spiral theory of knowledge, still get more from the answers that we previously covered. No, this is a bottomless well of wisdom that we've tapped into here.
Outstanding. Well, today, of course, we're getting a little bit controversial. Maybe 10, 12 years ago, this would have been even more controversial. And yet Leonard Peikoff's answers on these questions, brilliant, just brilliant, but grounded. We talked about Leonard Peikoff has acknowledged rationalistic tendencies, a bit of rationalism when he was younger. And it's so interesting to hear him give these kind of grounded, fully empirical answers on the topic today. Again, we're courting controversy. What is an objectivist? What does it mean to be an objectivist? Who are the good objectivists? And I love how Leonard approaches this. So I'm going to jump right into the first question. Leonard Peikoff was asked for his podcast, what is the definition of objectivist as a noun referring to a person?
Right. Well, we can call something objectivist. Is this an objectivist idea? Is this objectivist X? What is an objectivist person? Who is an objectivist?
and think of all the conflicts there have been over, well, this person's not an objectivist. This person's not. I'm an objectivist. Or you shouldn't call yourself an objectivist. We should only call ourselves students of objectivism, a perspective that I have respect for, even though I don't use that approach myself. So let me give the beginning of Dr. Peikoff's answer here. He says, and I love this, well, you could ask this about every philosophy. What's the definition of an Aristotelian or a Platonist? In one sense, it's very easy. One who advocates the philosophy of Aristotle or Plato. But practically, it's almost impossible to apply that to a particular case. There are many problems in determining whether a person accepts a given philosophy, including objectivism. He may accept it in abstract terms, but what about the issue of whether his actions bear any relation to what he says? Does he really subscribe to this philosophy, or does he just mouth it at parties? Does he understand Ayn Rand's ideas, or does he take them on faith? There are also degrees of understanding. How much does he understand? And if he understands existence exists, but he thinks the way to follow that is to live for everyone's existence, does he accept her philosophy? I'll skip forward a bit here because he gives many examples of the confusion there. He says, in many of these cases, there are degrees. A person may understand some important elements. He may act on some important principles. He may have perhaps some contradictions. So to answer this question, you'd have to know a tremendous amount and define the context. And he says, personally, I would not worry about whether the label applies or doesn't apply. What you should want to know, you judge the person according to what you know he upholds and how he acts, not according to a questionnaire or a detective's survey of his behavior. So long as you see he's consistent with objectivism, or he's inconsistent, and you know him well enough, you talk to him and point it out, and he's open to reason, well, then there's no problem. But there's no point in questions like, oh, my friend lies to his mother. Is he an objectivist or not? What is the difference whether he's an objectivist or not? The question is whether he's a hypocrite. Is he making a mistake? I mean, maybe his mother is really sick, and if he told her the truth, it would kill her. Or suppose you find out, well, he's a hater of the good for being the good. See, isn't that enough to say, no, he's not an objectivist? And then he wraps up with this. I think people, this is June of 2008, I think people are making too big of an issue of, well, does he belong to the club or not?
Amen.
Now think about, I won't go into it, but think about some of the challenges the objectivist movement ran into. in 2010 and 2012 and 2013. I think you know some of those events, and how much of that heartbreak and trouble could have been prevented if people had taken Leonard Peikoff to heart, and not just his conclusion. I think people make too big of an issue of does he belong to the club or not, but his analysis of what it means to actually hold a philosophy.
Absolutely agree. My God, the distinctions that he's making there are really critical. It's one thing to mouth a philosophy. It's one thing to, in effect, have it down in one sense in your mind. You can spin off the objectivist answer on any number of things philosophically. And what is your operative philosophy? What actually controls your behavior? And we can ask another question. What's influencing your psychology? What evaluations are making you feel the way you do? Now, feelings are not subject to moral evaluation, so I'd separate those out altogether. But those might have an influence on the way you behave, on the way you act. And so your operative philosophy might be very different from the philosophy that you, even in your own mind, claim to espouse. But that tension there has to be a concern to you. Objectivism, of course, rejects any theory-practice dichotomy. Root and branch, from metaphysics and epistemology through ethics and politics. So if you're looking at someone and they're being a hypocrite, that doesn't have any effect on the truth or falsehood of their ideas. They may be espousing a true or false philosophy, but how they act is what's telling you what is the operative philosophy. Now, many people don't have a clear and consistent philosophy. Many people are mixed bags and they'll act inconsistently. But even if a person calls themselves an objectivist, even if a person can give you the objectivist answer on any particular question, you still have got to go look at their behavior. Hey, that guy's a liar. Hey, that guy initiated force. Hey, that guy's being evasive. We right off the bat, you can say that's not objectivist, whatever he claims to be, whatever he claims to be. Objectivism is a philosophy for living on Earth. It's not just an abstract set of ideas. It's not just a mental puzzle in our heads. So there's different ways you can look at that question. But truly, there's a difference between someone's operative philosophy. They might just be a hypocrite, whatever that philosophy is, and what they espouse. That is critical.
Outstanding. Yeah, I think the comparison to Aristotelianism or Platonism, if somebody tells you I'm a Platonist, I think Plato got everything right. And then you look at the way he lives his life, you're going to see that philosophy inform various aspects of his life, but he's not necessarily going to be the archetype of Platonism. And in every given issue, he may not be a complete transcendentalist. He may be very practical and reasonable in ways that he thinks are consistent with Platonism.
Well, in fact, a lot of traditional philosophies, most traditional philosophies, cannot be consistently applied in reality. In effect, they demand hypocrisy. Altruism, of course, obviously springs to mind. One can't be a 100% dedicated full-time altruist. It's suicidal, it's self-destructive. And so even the altruist will say, well, of course, you have to be a little selfish sometimes. And justifying that excuse is, they'll have some altruist justification for that excuse. No, you see, you can't really live certain philosophies that really demand hypocrisy. Religion, certainly Christianity, says up front that we're all sinners. We couldn't live up to Christianity's perfection demands if we wanted to. So whether they say it out loud or not, most philosophies really cannot be consistently lived in practice other than objectivism.
That's an outstanding point. Certainly, if you're a Platonist, even if you're an Aristotelian, but go to some of those contradictions he never quite straightened out, you're going to run into ways in which you can't apply that philosophy. If you've got a philosophy that actually mapped onto reality, then I guess you wouldn't have to be hypocritical at all, would you? At least we're all finding that out. We have got, just real quick here before I get to the second question, which is related to the distinction you've made. Jeff Bannister is in the chat, and he is applying the trader principle. He says specifically, happy belated Trader Day. Let's talk value for value. I realize that ARCUK desires a certain level of trade with viewers to support its production of superb content. Every now and again, certain denominations of currency are lambasted for not being US dollars. I have to point out, Jeff is putting in super chats from Canada. I know a certain objectivist, and he's definitely an objectivist, I wouldn't question that. Initials YB, we'll leave it there, will sometimes get super chats in Canadian dollars and say, Oh, well, that $10 is worth about what, $9 US, $8 US. And well, we're not talking about $10 here. Jeff is in twice for $100 Canadian to support the Ayn Rand Center UK.
Wow.
Twice. His second comment with that same contribution says, the value I am trading is not the value of my country's currency, but the effort I put in to earn money. I expect to get more out of you than I put in. I have in spades received the quality content which is helpful for me to make my life better and learn more weekly. And,
Wow.
he's in yet a third time. Let me just finish reading. This is extremely generous, so I've got to read his statements here. I do wish that effort would be made to not belittle currencies from other countries whose government policies debase their own currencies. That said, it may be a small gripe, but it would be appreciated if our input value would be valued equally. Thanks for trading. Well, Jeff, I absolutely agree with that you find that a little, it's not always handled well. When people say, oh yeah, that's £2 UK, that's worth a lot. Oh, $2 Canadian, not as much. There's no reason for that. There's no reason. In fact, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a sneak preview. Tomorrow's show that I'm doing an episode on grace, an episode on graciousness. And to look a gift horse in the mouth in such a way is a complete failure of graciousness, if you ask me. And you didn't ask what you put in the chat. I think it's amazing that we now have $300 in the chat. The fact that it's Canadian money just means you're in Canada, and it's awesome that you have done that. In fact, we sometimes say the Canadian economy isn't as free as ours, although in some ways it's more free. You're having to work harder for that money than the average American. Either way, it's irrelevant. The point is, it's greatly appreciated.
We should appreciate it more.
Yes.
If they come from a more challenging economy, right? To that extent, and it's connected to what we're saying here today. Everyone, as we'll discuss later, everyone's got their own individual context. And objectivism is all about recognizing that context. And if you're giving us Swedish krona, if you're giving us drachma, if you're giving us Canadian dollars, we should be just as grateful, maybe even more grateful that you, from a more difficult context, are making that commitment to your long-term values. So thank you, Jeff.
On top of that, even if it was a numbers game and we want to appreciate big contributions more than little ones, Jeff has always given he has been one of the most generous people supporting the ARCUK as well as other shows that he believes in. And Jeff, I can tell you, and I'll try to put the word out there, spread it around a bit, guys. You're really being ingracious here. This is not, it's clever, and yeah, you want to appreciate larger contributions more than lesser ones, but a guy like Jeff, who's always contributing larger than most everyone else.
One of my heroes.
Yeah, too awesome. Stephanie says it's not optimal, Jeff. I agree. We'll have to berate certain personage who aren't here right now. Now, Stephanie actually works with some high-level objectivists, so she's in a position at least to put that in their ear, although she works directly with Dr. Binswanger, and he never makes those kind of comments. But I know she's got the ear of others as well, and that's good. And yes, Stephanie, we can see your comments. Thank you for that. One more real quick. I don't want to get too distracted from the topic, but that was massive generosity and willingness to trade on Jeff's part, and I deeply appreciate that. Real quick, another super chat in from Apollo Zeus, £5 from the UK, says, is it rational to sometimes take a vacation from objectivism for rest and recuperation reasons? Well, he puts a laughing face on it, so I think he knows the answer in advance, but that's a great topic too. We've talked about guilty pleasures, which are really guilty pleasures. They're fully contextual if they're not irrational. That would be a great topic, but let me hold off on that if I could, unless you have something right away you want to say, James.
Well, it obviously depends on what you mean by taking a break from objectivism. What all you mean is taking a break from the in-depth, hardcore study of the subject of objectivism, then yes, we all need occasional breaks from any kind of hardcore study, whether it's physics or history or anything else. But on the other hand, it is my philosophy for living. It informs me how to think. It informs my basic values. And so I am a 100% full-time, 24/7 dedicated objectivist, even even when I'm enjoying values that Ayn Rand didn't enjoy herself. But we can get to that later.
Yes, yes. I'm just looking at the chat because Stephanie right away says, well, my contribution is small, but regular, automatic 10 pounds a month. What she's referring to there is she is a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK. So am I. I know you are too, James. If you go to aynrandcenter.co.uk, and a link is already in the chat there, you can join for a member for 10 pounds a month, support the organization. It all goes to keeping the organization alive. The meetups, the meetings, the large get-togethers, the one that was in England this year was amazing. I was there for that. But also everything this channel does, including our producer behind the scenes, making it all happen. Apollo Zeus says, it was a joke. Never, ever, ever say to somebody, I was only joking, because you're right, it was just a joke. But there are some great insights to come out of a joke like that.
That's right.
Yes, but he says, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Good humor always has a grain of truth.
It does. And he says, I meant it as an escape from personal responsibility. Well, I've talked about that attitude, the lost weekend attitude. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And my answer to that is what happens in Vegas never, ever stays in Vegas. The minute you say about anything in your life, well, it's only in my mind. Right. Only I will know. You have just made yourself less important than everything else out there and have tried to alienate yourself from reality. I know I'm not talking to Apollo Zeus. He's like, no, it was just a joke. But this is an important matter, because that attitude of, I've earned a lost weekend. I've earned what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's a recipe for disaster. We'll talk about that another time, because I want to get back to the outstanding answers of Leonard Peikoff, because question number 2 takes us a step further. You talk about how this is not easy stuff. Well, Leonard Peikoff was asked, what kind of commitment does it take to master objectivism as a tool for living a just and happy life? Does it take a short time to learn and a lifetime to master? That idea, it takes a short time to learn, but a lifetime to master. And I won't give the full long answer here, but Leonard Peikoff says, in the right definition, I would say yes to that. Short time to learn, long time to master. Ayn Rand distinguished between what she called a philosophy for Reardon and philosophy as a profession, what you would call philosophy for action. What Reardon requires for living a just and happy life is much less. He has to know certain essentials. He has to appreciate the role of the mind, the need for honesty, rationality, and he's living in a firm reality and has to hold certain convictions and so forth. But he does not have to know all of the complexities that are involved in defining all of these issues, their applications, their foundations, and their interconnections. They can't be just a memorized set, but on the other hand, you can simplify them to the point where they are a guide to practical living. Those he has to learn fully within the needs of his own context. A few years of study would take you beyond that. And then let me skip forward a bit, because he talks about then what does it take to become a master of this. He says, in my experience, that took a very, very long time. I was introduced to Ayn Rand in 1951 and struck by her philosophy, decided to devote my life to understanding it. I would say that by 1968, I had a glimmer of what she was talking about. So 17 years later.
17 years, he's beginning to get a glimmer.
I understand certain things clearly.
He could meet with Ayn Rand at least once a week and ask all his questions of her, and it still's taking him 17 years.
17 years with Ayn Rand, and he realizes, as much as I know, there's still so much before I can call myself a master of this. Right. He says, it wasn't until 1990, when I finished OPAR, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, that I would say I really had mastered her philosophy and understood it inside and out. So it was about 40 years as a full-time profession. Let me stop from the quote there, because I'm loving this distinction. Yes. I know there are people, a lot of us, who discovered these ideas, started applying them right away. You might say at the level of philosophy for Reardon, and yet we also still feel this passion to continue to learn and to study the lectures, or study all of the books, or listen to every Ford Hall forum, and then go on to the advanced courses like Understanding Objectivism and Objectivism through Induction, and applying to the Ayn Rand University through the Ayn Rand Institute, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting, because you could say at a certain point, if we were actually applying these ideas, not just learning and waiting for them to affect our life, but going out there and living a rational life. We had philosophy for Reardon. But have you noticed, or do you, maybe not everybody does, but did you also experience this passion to keep studying and keep getting a better understanding?
Well, if you're a professional intellectual, obviously, it will behoove you to master the subject of epistemology. Whatever your field is, it will touch on it. It would be a good idea to have an understanding of where your values come from, how you use the words good and bad and what they mean to you. And basic questions like that are going to pervade every intellectual field of study. So I would say if you're a Hank Reardon, if you're a businessman, if you're just out there earning a good, honest, productive living, you don't probably need the in-depth study that, say, an intellectual does. And at even higher level, there's professional philosophers. They, of course, have to master it inside and out. They have to anticipate questions. They have to have thoroughly chewed the matter. They have to be on the cutting edge if you're going to be a professional philosopher on the subject of objectivism. But there's a huge difference between Leonard Peikoff's level of understanding. He presents it sort of modestly here when he talks about a glimmer versus really grasping it when he's finally done writing the treatise on it. Obviously, that's at an entirely different level than most people will ever get to or need to get to. Objectivism really is a very easily grasped philosophy in one sense. It is the corruptions of other philosophies. It's the corruption of religious thinking. It's the corruption of contemporary post-Kantian philosophy that really creates the interference, the static interference, which makes it difficult for people to grasp because they have emotionally been conditioned with different ideas since their childhood and bombarded with different ideas with the culture. So what they need in this culture is that self-defense so that they can grasp, the pushback on that, so that they can grasp basic ideas that really are not that difficult to grasp. The ordinary person of ordinary intelligence can grasp the basic principles of objectivism, and they can grasp it from reality up in an inductive way and in a useful way for their lives. We have the truth and reality on our side, which really is a big advantage here, which makes it possible for someone who has mastered objectivism to explain the basics, how this is going to help your life, understanding objectivity, understanding where values come from and what they are. That's going to help your life across the board. And those basics can be understood by just about any person of ordinary intelligence, in my experience.
Yes, philosophy for Reardon. He does point out it's easier now because of all the subsequent writing that Ayn Rand did.
Oh,
and
amen.
Now all of the writing that he has done, and he it's funny because he always talks about being immodest about it, but I still think he's too modest.
He is too modest.
When you consider his outstanding lectures, OPAR itself, again, the advanced courses, there are many of them. Some of those used to be extremely expensive, and now they're all free on the internet.
Right,
amazing.
Right. And we have this book, the book that he says, I finally understand objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Think of it, we have the upshot of that, a book that I think most people could read and grasp and understand at a basic level. That's what's wonderful about that book. It works for professionals at the highest level, and it works as a guide for people trying to figure out their own philosophy. And think about that. All the work that he did has made it so much easier for the rest of us to understand and grasp.
It is amazing to read Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, and read how dense the book is, how much it covers within its pages. And yet at the same time, it was written that anybody who's willing to put in the work can understand it. It does not require an academic philosophy career to get 90%, 99% of what's in there out of it. It's incredibly dense, but also incredibly accessible. He wraps up here real quick. He says, I think it would be a lot faster today precisely because of the subsequent elaboration. We talked about that. He says, I also think it would be a lot easier if you were brought up in a more rational culture because you wouldn't have continual conflicts between the false philosophic ideas that you unconsciously accepted growing up and the new ones you heard. You wouldn't be in continual bafflement. And then he finally says, well, that's my answer. I just want to point out also that to master a philosophy does not mean omniscience. There can always be applications or implications that you did not know, even if you know the philosophy inside out. So that can't be your standard. The standard has to be basically, if I can be immodest about it, again, this is Leonard Peikoff speaking, that you can write OPAR. If you can do that, then you can say you've mastered it. Or if you can't write it, you can at least thoroughly understand it. Again, Leonard Peikoff always trying to be modest and acknowledging that he's not able to, because he knows he's done such great work.
He does. He has to. No,
Johnny
truly.
Ruiz is in the chat and says, thank you for this thoughtful discussion, puts 1999 on it. I'm not going to even talk about which denomination that is, but it is generous and very much appreciated. Again, your super chats, including those 3 very generous and very just and well-traded super chats earlier from Jeff Bannister, are all appreciated. And they all go to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. And the week after Thanksgiving, I couldn't be more thankful for your willingness to trade value for value here. Very generous. And thank you for the compliment as well, Johnny. To question number 3, though, it is time consuming and difficult work to get a solid grasp of objectivism. Will this change if and when the culture improves, or will it always be difficult to learn? Well, I think Dr. Peikoff kind of answered that in the last one, but he goes on to say, I would say it will be easier in many respects. Although parts of philosophy are difficult, especially epistemology and the foundations of ethics. I found those 2 the most complex and the most time-consuming. And if you're going to understand them in detail and in a reality-oriented way, well, those are not going to be easy. But everything in philosophy will be easier in a better society. And then the next question he goes on, if it will become easier, why? And Leonard Peikoff says, the questioner lists a number of factors, all of which I agree with. Children being inculcated with rationality from the start. Let me pause there. If you know any objectivist families with children, A, it blows away the idea that objectivism is anti-family or anti-children. And B, the children of these rational parents, are these not just some of the best, most delightful people you've ever met?
Absolutely. Boy, what a great observation. As most of my objectivist friends do have kids, and man, are they different than most of the kids I see of their generation. Utterly different. And that, I think, speaks well both to the parents and to the philosophy of objectivism. In most cases, they're not indoctrinating ideas that are way above the kid's head. They're just getting them on a basic reality orientation, a basic self-confidence orientation, a basic don't feel guilty for wanting and being selfish and ambitious orientation. And when they have that as a foundation, a real, you'd think it was a straightforward, simple foundation, as opposed to, say, the self-esteem destroying, rationality destroying ideas of, say, Christianity that most American kids are raised on today. And that's the contrast I have here. Is it easier to get across a totally irrational, contradictory, incomprehensible, unlivable philosophy like Christianity that we educate and raise kids on? Or would it be easier to start with reality, the reality that they can see, and work up from there based only on truth that they can grasp with their own minds, that isn't contradictory, that can be lived in reality? Well, I'm going to give the nod there to objectivism. And once that's the educational context, will it be infinitely easier? Yeah. It seems to me we've got a great advantage over those mystical, unlivable philosophies of the past.
You know, if you don't know any objectivist parents, I recommend you get out there and meet some. And I won't name any names, but you meet these kids, and 2 things come out. The first thing that's obvious is the extraordinary intelligence. When you hear anything about their schoolwork, the kind of assignments they turn in, copies of some of their papers that they've written, you know, in grade 4 or grade 8 show up on the internet, and these kids are writing in ways that a lot of the people I went to college with could not possibly have written.
Well, they're writing at a college level.
Especially their respect
for development. Yeah.
Their respect for 2 fields in particular, art and history. You know, the papers they write on literature, their love of literature, and their respect for history. And then the other thing, besides that they're ridiculously smart, is they're just some of the best people. The joy, this benevolence, the playfulness, and they're involved, they're engaged. You know, think of homeschool kids don't learn to socialize. These are kids who are going out and, you know, getting in work programs or doing plays, putting on productions, having fiction readings, and I just love that. So yeah, when I think of, well, what would objectivism look like in a better culture, all I have to do is look at the kids of objectivist parents today and think, imagine if most of the world was like that. So going on, yes, if it becomes easier, why will it become easier? And Leonard Peikoff says, all of which I agree, children being inculcated with rationality from the start. So there's that. And having to overcome not having to overcome rationalism, having abundant cultural data that makes it easier and more natural to induce the right principles, not having to overcome wrong views that have become inculcated and automatized, such as religion and altruism. And you mentioned both of those earlier.
Those are killers. If you destroy reason, if you destroy self-esteem, if you make I want into a sin, what do you undermine their happiness, you've undermined their confidence, you've undermined their mind altogether. But if you just start out with these basic ideas and in simple ways observe the importance of that and don't interfere with the child's development of those things, man, Marx had an absurd view of what Marxism would do for the future. He thought that in a communist society, they'd be the perfect communist society, they'd be producing Shakespeare's and geniuses on that level on a routine basis. Well, that's obviously an unrealistic view. But, if someone were to press me on that on an objectivist society, I'd say, yeah, we'd be producing a lot more great minds. I don't know if everyone would be a Shakespeare or an Isaac Newton, like Marx said. But on the other hand, would all this epistemological interference be gone? Would all this unearned guilt be gone so they could have confidence? So they could know what have confidence in reason and have confidence in their personal values? Would we produce happier people? Would they be more productive, rational people? You bet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the chat, our producer says, fun fact, any monetary support for ARCUK is a Christmas present, since YouTube pays out earnings around the 24th of the month. So there you go. Anything that you put in is going to come out for Christmas.
Right. If you subscribe right now.
That's so much fun.
Giving us a Christmas present.
Yes. And Kometcha is in for €2. I appreciate that. And, it occurs to me, talking to Jeff's comment about how some people are not cool about the currency and the kind of particular kind of money they're contributing. One of the things I like about mentioning that, these were, $20 Canadian, $2 euro, whatever it's just, I love the fact that we have people from around the world. I love it when, Swedish krona come in, they're coming in from Sweden or someplace that uses that currency. It's fun. It's light. It's the way I've always felt about race. It should be optional, and it should only ever be a positive thing to say, oh, what a beautiful Black woman, what a gorgeous Chinese man. It should only ever be optional and fun. And so I hope when you hear me use currency in the chat, it's just because I find it charming.
And let me add one more thing on currency, if I can, for just a second. The US currency is just a Federal Reserve note. It's really just a promise to pay. It's not money in the ultimate sense. I'm with those objectivist economists who say only a commodity like gold can be money, only something that can extinguish a debt. In reality, not just a debt for another debt can be money. So even American money is just a IOU in effect against the government, just like any other national currency is.
You're absolutely right. A lot of objectivists tend to be critics of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular, because it's not backed by anything. What the hell is the US dollar?
What the heck is the US dollar?
It's got, and I'm not saying that Bitcoin is great. What I'm saying is the US currency isn't.
Inflation.
Yeah, exactly right. Yes, and equal to the reality is in the chat for £5. So from the UK, again, the fun part of that is this is the Ayn Rand Center UK. So when pound notes come in, that's like, oh yeah, over there, back the mother country. It's amusing to those of us in the colonies. He says, thanks for all the fish. Well, of course, Douglas Adams fans will recognize that line from the sequel to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. That Charming. Very good. Now,
Well, thank you for the
yes,
fish.
thank you for the fish. Thank you very much. And Leonard Peikoff wraps up that answer. He says, now, all of this is true. All of the gains we'll have in a better culture for learning objectivism. Plus, not having been told that abstractions are detached from reality and that to be practical, you have to be concrete bound. Above all, because the root of making any thought difficult is the college professors who wage war on your crippled mind without them, let alone with their replacement by rational men. Can you imagine that? It will become much easier to learn anything, including chemistry, unquote. Yes, it's almost hard to imagine what a rational philosophy would do for every subject.
Well, I can just tell you in my own experience when writing Creating Christ, it's not objectivism technically per se. It's just it's history. It's ancient history. I only accidentally backed into ideas that help confirm in my mind certain objectivist principles, and that was by sheer accident. But what I had with me all along was the objectivist epistemology. I knew I had to do this inductively. I knew I had to ground every point in evidentiary fact that could be observed. I knew I had to integrate it consistently and logically. I knew my concepts had to be objective, had to be objectively defined and examples given so that people can concretely see what I mean and what I don't mean. Without that methodology, it would have been impossible for me to even attempt to be an objective historian.
I can see that. I can see it in your writing.
Thank you.
Incidentally, if anybody hasn't read Creating Christ yet, if you need the teaser for that, do a quick search on all the video services, because now on just about all of the video services, you can watch a documentary that was made using Jim Valliant and Warren Fahey's source material. And of course, Jim and Warren are featured throughout the documentary. That will get you a little up to speed. Then you can read the book. Highly recommended. I know you don't want to recommend it yourself because you are that kind of modest guy, but no, I absolutely recommend
although
that.
recommending it, I would caution people that it is not objectivism. It's an objectivist, and I would call myself in this context an objectivist doing ancient history. Totally different.
But isn't that a lot of what we do here on the Ayn Rand Center UK? We do often, I always have to point out that I am not speaking as a spokesman for objectivism in any way. Yes, I am an objectivist. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what it means to call yourself an objectivist. But no, in that regard, I'm just some guy, and you take me based on your interpretation of the rationality of what I've got to present on its own merits. I do not hang on the coattails of Ayn Rand or Leonard Peikoff.
You know, we each have to think for ourselves. So there is no final authority any more than there is in physics. So,
yeah, and then there's personal views too. what some have called optional values, what Greg Salmieri calls personal values. And in that regard, question number 5, do you distinguish official objectivist doctrine? Oh man, sometimes you hit the words in these questions and you just want to stop and say, what do you mean doctrine? Do you distinguish official objectivist doctrine from Ayn Rand's personal views? Well, Leonard Peikoff was asked that, and he answered, philosophy is broad principles about the nature of the universe, the means of knowledge, and the nature of man. And then the value doctrines, which all that leads to. All of this is interconnected. In a proper philosophy, it's all one system, as in objectivism. Well, that does not mean that every specific application of that philosophy is inherent in the philosopher. A philosopher can hold views that do not necessarily follow from the philosophy, but are its applications to a realm where facts are established by science or by observation or by some other appropriate means. Philosophy is wide abstractions, but does not entail specific choices or specific interpretations of how those abstractions apply to concretes. And Leonard Peikoff says, for instance, take my theory of history as presented in my book, The Dim Hypothesis. I make a definite distinction between official objectivist doctrine and Peikoff's theory of history. I believe my theory is based on objectivism, but it does not follow from objectivism. It is not, therefore, objectivism as such. It is my application, and each person has to decide whether this is a correct application or not. It's not subjective, but it's still not a question of what the philosophy is, but rather what its applications are. In that regard, Ayn Rand and I and others can disagree without anyone contradicting the philosophy. Remember also that there are personal options in applying broad philosophic principles. You can say, for instance, that sex is good is a philosophic principle, but that does not necessitate any special particular position, clothing, whatever. It does specify that the general principles of morality apply, such as the evil of fraud or force or evasion. Apart from that, there are many different interpretations and complete options, which would be personal and not official. In answer to the question, then, yes, but without implying a contradiction or subjective viewpoint.
Not at all. Not at all. There is a distinction that I would draw. There are a couple of distinctions here that are important to draw. Philosophy is the broadest of all subjects. It is the most widely applicable, and therefore it has to be, in one sense, the most basic to grasp at one level. Now, if you're going to be an expert and get into all the technical questions, that requires real expertise. But the point is, this is so broadly applicable. Think of what philosophy is. It's studying the relationship between existence and human consciousness. Therefore, it has applications everywhere. But because of that breadth, it's not giving you any particular answer. So every other field has a sort of a philosophy of component to it, a philosophy of law, a philosophy of history. That is the application of philosophical principles to the methodology of a particular science or subject. And those, Ayn Rand didn't have a completely worked out philosophy of history. She didn't have a completely worked out philosophy of law. What she did have was a worked out philosophy. And so if someone comes along and has a philosophy of history or a philosophy of law, it's an application of that, but it's a philosophical application of that. So it's still at the level of philosophy, but requires real expertise. And in this case, you've got to know something about history or know something about law in order to even begin to apply, how do we approach the subjects of philosophy or, history or law. That's the first thing to note. But also, people have contexts, personal contexts. We all have our own psychologies. We all have our own interests. That does not mean that they're subjective. What can be, objectivism says be rational and productive and independent. So I should, if I can, I've got to take care of myself, go out productive, have a central purpose. That sort of thing. What is my productive purpose? Doctor, lawyer, plumber.
No, you have to be an architect.
Range of rational choices here that are equally rational, but would be different from person to person and objective from person to person. It would have been totally subjective for me, say, to become a surgeon. That is not something I would have enjoyed or gotten reward out of, even though I admire greatly all doctors. So even if it's a personal context decision, it doesn't make it subjective at all. Now, if you say my personal preference is to go be a mass murderer, obviously that's out of bounds for objectivism and a clear-cut case of a contradiction to objectivism. But there are a whole range of optional values within objectivism.
Yes. And but doesn't that leave open? Well, let me go to the next question here, because I know there are people out there thinking, it's all starting to sound kind of like everything's options. And I thought we had a movement going here.
You can't be a thief. You can't. Well, see, in your romantic life, if you were to lie to your romantic partner, objectivism would say, no, that's wrong. That's dishonest. You can't attempt to gain a value, say the impressing your romantic partner or fooling your romantic partner if you're having an affair or something. You can't attempt to gain a value by faking reality. So there are a lot of things that are really clear cut from the philosophy of objective. You have to be productive. You can't be a thief. You can't be some parasite thief. You have to do some real productive work if you're going to be productive. So there are certain things that are very clear cut and not optional. All we're saying is that within certain valid principles, they have a wide range of application, and psychological application as well. It's not just issues like productivity. Like Ayn Rand, when she grew up, one of the spiritual values she had was her tiddlywink music, turn of the century, lighthearted, gay music, meaning that in the old term gay, that she was into. Now that kind of tiddlywink music is dated for me. To me, I can't fully get into it in the same way that Ayn Rand did, but that's a generational thing. I posted on Facebook the other day what was it? Oh, it was a Petula Clark song, Downtown. That was my tiddlywink music when I was a kid, but I come from a different context. It's a happy, benevolent, bright song, nothing but cheerfulness. And so that to me in my childhood was my tiddlywink music. We each have a context. We each have psychologies. And that does not mean that objectivism doesn't apply to it. It just means that there's a variety of contexts and a wide range of applications to these valid principles because they're at such a broad level of abstraction.
Yes. So Leonard Peikoff was asked in July of 2012, well, is there an actual movement called objectivism, or is it just a philosophy, or both? And Leonard Peikoff answers. I'll give people a moment to think, what do you think the answer to that one's going to be? Leonard Peikoff answers, primarily, it's a philosophy. You can call it a movement only insofar as there is a significant group of people who accept it and act to promote it. So you might say the Ayn Rand Institute spearheads a movement. Essentially, I would say that. But a movement and a philosophy are independent and variable over time. Objectivism was a philosophy far before there was a movement. And Aristotle has been a philosophy from the beginning, but was not a movement in the ancient world. He only became a movement centuries later. They are separate.
They are indeed. Aristotle really didn't generate a movement that would later take over the classical world at all. It was Platonism and Neoplatonism that took over the Roman world and brought the classical world to an end, actually. And Aristotle, for it to have the Aristotelianism, to really have a movement, a group of philosophers advocating it and applying it to their own work, that took till the Middle Ages. That, if you think about it, over 1,000 years had to pass before Aristotle actually had a true Aristotelian movement, among Christians and Jews, Maimonides and Aquinas, and especially Aquinas, because he really systematically applied Aristotle's ideas. And by the end of the 1500s, Aristotle and Aquinas were becoming, in part, built into the doctrine of the Catholic Church, obviously inconsistently, but that's a movement.
Yeah, and it's interesting from that perspective, and we'll be talking more about this next week, to consider that there are a few, not a lot, but there are a few movement objectivists out there who don't strike me as philosophical objectivists, and people essentially wearing this philosophy like armor and holding it like a weapon without it really, it's like they're wearing the colors of the wrong team.
Right. What they're trying to do is glom onto Ayn Rand's popularity. Ayn Rand is popular among young people and the thoughtful, and she has a vast following. Her novels have sold millions of books worldwide. And what they want to do when they call themselves objectivists, and they're not really objectivists. See, if someone says to me these days, I'm an objectivist, that really means almost nothing to me. It goes in one ear and out the other. And until I get some substance to that, I'm not even begin to evaluate whether a person is actually an objectivist, even in their mind, even just in thought. Until I begin to understand what a person actually actually knows and believes. I'm in no position to make that evaluation. So that's a very important distinction to draw. And there are a lot of people who peddle anti-objectivist ideas, not just non-objectivist ideas, not only their own little shtick or twist on it, but they're actually contradicting in fundamental ways Ayn Rand's ideas or trying to push it in a different direction and still claiming the moniker of objectivism.
Right.
That most people are just liars trying, in my view. If they're not liars, they don't understand objectivism at all. In most cases, they're just trying to glom on to the popularity they see Ayn Rand has.
Yeah, I see that. I see that where people want the self-esteem, the pride that comes from holding usually not rational ideas, but at least virtues, of claiming to adopt these virtues, and therefore to have the self-esteem. And it's, of course, pseudo self-esteem. And yet they don't actually want to do these things. So you're right. They bring in their own pragmatism, their own rationalism, their own wanting what's in Vegas to stay in Vegas, and 1,000 exceptions to the point where there's actually no substance and all they are is exceptions, but they've got the label. Yeah, I've read all of Ayn Rand's books, and therefore I know that you're wrong about everything. And
context.
Yeah. It's like a movement without a philosophy. They're all movement, all war, all weapons, all the time. And well, how's that working out for you? What's that doing for you in your own life?
Integrity is one of the primary virtue, one of the 7 main virtues, according to Ayn Rand. Integrity. And first of all, knowing what principles are and understanding their importance and applying those principles to your life consistently. Integrity, living your philosophy, is an important aspect of objectivism. So an objectivist hypocrite, to that extent, is really violating an objectivist principle right off the bat there. And if they don't really appreciate the full scope of objectivism, they're in no position to even call themselves an objectivist, in my view. Right. And in many cases, people are advocating tolerance for true absolute mysticism, or in the more subtle cases, as you point out, they're willing to compartmentalize certain things away, so that they can get along with conservatives and work with conservatives in many cases, or libertarians in many cases. Those are the people who really are, I think, giving objectivism a bad name because they're using it, but not understanding it.
Right. And such a waste. The owner's manual for life, the truest set of ideas that have ever been produced, and consistent and integrated, what that makes possible in your life. And then some people say, no, I use that just for arguing politics. It's such a waste.
No such thing as objectivist physics or objectivist history or objectivist psychology, right? Or objectivist engineering or objectivist medicine. No, there's objective medicine. There's objective physics. Philosophy informs us on what objectivity consists of. So to understand that concept, what does it boil down to? Having an objective method, a method that keeps us in contact with reality. That's what objectivity is. Now, we need philosophy at some level to tell us what objectivity is, but philosophy doesn't dictate to physics their answers, predict their answers, tell them what their answers have to be. Physicists still have to go out and look, and to know you've got to look, and they've got to figure it out using their own methodology as well. That is to say, the methodology of having objective concepts and using logic and grounding everything in observation. But there will be special rules and types of applications for each given field, so that objectivity in that field is the important concept. And that has to be consistent with philosophical objectivity, obviously. But I would draw a very important distinction between those two things.
Yes, yes. And that distinction between the movement and the philosophy brings additional clarity to the question of, what do you mean by saying you're an objectivist? And what's it doing for you in your own life? We are going to talk more about that next week, because you have already outlined the questions for next week. No, I'm going to keep it a teaser. I'm not going to tell everybody in advance what they are. But this discussion will bear additional fruit next week. If this seemed a little bit controversial, given objectivism's recent history, next week should be even more compelling for folks to listen to.
We will be developing these ideas further next week. So tune in. Same bat time, same bat channel.
And if you don't see the pay dirt, if you don't see the dollar values of these ideas, you will next week. Speaking of dollar values, again, I want to send big thanks out to the folks in the chat, especially our supporters in the super chat. Jeff has been generous beyond all measure. And I know it's all value for value, and it's not to say there's any sacrifice involved, but not everybody is willing to put their money where their mouth is in the way that Jeff does. I don't mean to credit anybody else down. I just want to say, Jeff, that's amazing. It's outstanding. It is appreciated. And it makes me, and I'm sure James, you as well, feel it's all worth it. People are getting out of these ideas and these conversations the value.
It's because Jeff sees it as his selfish interest to do that. I want to thank him for his selfishness. Let me repeat that and put it in italics. Thank you for your selfishness, which in my mind, I equate with benevolence itself. So thank you for loving life. Thank you for being rational. Thank you for being committed to the long term of your values. Thank you for your selfishness. It's the only thing that can do the world or anyone else any good. So thank you.
Outstanding. If we continue to do what we're doing and we continue to grow, it's because of the support of people like Apollo, like Johnny, like our producer in the chat as well, and Kametcha and Equal to Reality. And again, I hate to draw comparisons, but for that kind of contribution, I got to put Jeff up on the pedestal today. Thank you so much for that. I'm enjoying these conversations even more than ever. And this is what makes it all possible. Next week, we hit hard with related questions that take us even in the more personal direction of what is it to be an objectivist? What is this stuff doing for you? What does it mean to be authentic? We're going to have a great conversation next week, but today's, I think, was great too. James, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you, Robert. My goodness, these are always great. Oh, you're wonderful.
Thank you. Now, this is the last day of November, so I'm going to go from gratitude mode to goodwill mode tomorrow, and that means next week we will pump it up for the holidays. If you don't think that Christmas is an objectivist holiday, go to the Ayn Rand lexicon, look up Christmas. It's all right there for you, and we're going to be having more discussions about that as well. James, thank you so much for an outstanding show.
Thank you, sir. Take care.
Everybody, have a great weekend.